session is being recorded. I also want to, before we get to some housekeeping and then move to our speakers, I want to, again, take this opportunity to ask us to pause and think about the moment that we're in. The racial reckoning, I guess, is the optimistic way of thinking about it. But the racial violence and the lack of accountability that I think a lot of us are concerned about. I'm going to put in the chat the links to these two organizations that we're suggesting if you want to take a moment to support. One is the Funders Collaborative for Youth Organizing, and the other is Dignity in Schools. And let's just take 30 seconds, 60 seconds to pause and reflect. We'll jump in. Thank you. One of the other things something we did in the last session that I'd like to do again is, this is a Zoom webinar as opposed to a Zoom meeting, which means that the attendees can't see each other and can't even see who's there. So it's nice to introduce ourselves and let us know, let everyone know that you're there. So if you have a moment, just go into the chat and put your name and affiliation in the chat so other people can see who's in the group, who's in the room. And the chat also can be used throughout the panel to exchange ideas, provide links. Thank you, Miriam. Miriam, I don't know if you're hearing this one, but she's been providing a wonderful amount of links to resources. The Q&A is the resource that we use to ask questions of the panelists. We're going to do something a little different on this third panel than we did on the first two, in that when we get to the Q&A, when we get to questions, instead of me providing or offering the questions to the two panelists, I'm going to try to bring you into the room if you're asking the question, and you could ask the question, and then you get to sit back down just like a real room. And we're just going to give that a go. And then once the question has been answered, it'll be moved over to the dismissed part of the Q&A where everyone will be able to see those asked questions. Until then, you won't be able to see who's posting what question. So with that housekeeping, let me introduce, did you two decide David's going first?
Yes.
Okay. I'll introduce both of you now, but I'll introduce David first. So Arizona State University professor David Garcia researches issues of policy implementation, school choice, and accountability laws. Of particular interest here is that he's devoted a great deal of time and effort to working with state-level policymakers, and has himself served as the Associate Superintendent for Public Instruction for Arizona, and he was also the Democratic Party nominee for governor of Arizona a couple of years back. Laurie Shepherd is the former dean here at CU Boulder School of Education and is currently a distinguished professor here at the school. She's also the former president of pretty much every organization. Let's see, the AERA, NCME, the National Academy of Education, and probably a couple more. I'm not going to list all the areas she's influenced with her research, but for purposes of this session, I want to note that she's been thinking about the relative roles now played by high-stakes standardized state assessments versus teacher-developed classroom assessments, as well as the growing use of interim assessments like the MAP and the iReady. So maybe we'll be able, hopefully we'll be able to get to some of those issues. So let me turn this over to David. and look forward to hearing from both of you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Let me pull up my couple slides here. Hold on a second. We had this down. All right. Everyone see that? I'm assuming Kevin can see it. Everyone can see it. Good. Kevin, thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this panel with Laurie. I'm excited to be here, even if it is Zoom and virtual, partly because I've had to miss the last couple of years of this gathering in person, because as Kevin said, I was out running for office. Years back, I came to the conclusion that if we wanted to change policy, we had to change who was at the table, and ran for state office a couple different times, including being the gubernatorial candidate for the state of Arizona in this last election. Experiences that I'm bringing with me now into my own scholarship. I just finished a book manuscript on the intersection between research policy and politics, tentatively titled Teach Truth to Power, where one of the things that I do argue is that we are writing to a mythical policymaker that really doesn't exist out there. We have politicians and professional staff, and the book is about how to engage specifically with politicians. And so I have my head and my thinking right now in this sort of research utilization space, and how we take what we know and engage specifically politicians in helping to inform policy. And so when I got the question from Kevin, I read it and thought through a couple things. I needed to make, in my opinion, some edits to the question. First, I wasn't sure what he meant by behind. And I should have just called and asked him, what do you mean by behind? And why do you have behind in quotes there? Instead I spent some time and energy thinking through, well, what could it mean by behind? How could we not be behind? And maybe behind is, he's thinking, maybe he wants me to think of this a bit relatively. I got a little preview of that, Kevin, in the last session where you talked about sort of people promoting their own perspectives. And I do comment on that here. The other thing that I found a bit, I guess I had a hard time with this term, and that was school closures. Because school closures gave the impression that schooling was no longer happening. That, and it is, it may not have been happening the same way. It certainly was in a different format. I changed it to building closures because it's the physical place that is closed, but schools are still trying to engage in the process of schooling. And then last, I did change the focus on remote education. Remote education tells me that this is happening away from schools, but what's intriguing to me is that it's not just happening away from schools, it's happening at home. And it is the at home part that I find to be of particular interest for a few reasons that I will mention later. So I switched it a little bit to building closures and whether we are behind as a result of a reliance on at-home learning necessarily, as opposed to remote education. And so the answer is, yeah, of course we are. By the way, I should know that I took this and I'm giving you much of the same advice that I would give to district superintendents, politicians when they call me, prospective politicians, candidates, trying to think of who else calls me, reporters. And they ask, besides what I just told Kevin, besides the question, what would you do if you were governor, which is a question I get quite a bit. I do get a lot of questions about education. And the answer is yes, we are behind. I can't think, and nothing I've seen in the literature to date tells me how we couldn't be behind after a sudden and unexpected stoppage in physical face-to-face teaching and a whole-scale movement to a different medium delivery of instruction. And yes, we're behind. But if we leverage what we already know in the literature to predict what will happen next, by the way, another part of the book that I think we need to do more of as academics, there's a couple things that I think I tell folks to anticipate, that the building closures will result in learning loss for just about everyone. However, the existing opportunity gaps, much of what many of you have written about very, very well, much of what we know already creates inequalities, are going to be exacerbated underneath in a remote environment for a number of reasons. And I know that there is a lot put out from a from a PR perspective, from a promotion perspective, about the possibilities of online learning and what it can bring and how its ways of promoting education. But I would argue that the fundamental dynamics of opportunity gaps are going to continue. Nothing I've seen to date tells me they're not going to continue to play out in the online environment in the exact same way we've seen it play out historically in the face-to-face environment. And so when I'm talking to school districts or reporters, I'm reminding them that a lot of those same gaps are going to continue to exist, if not get worse, given what we've already know and see in the literature. I also believe that we have spent a significant amount of time on what I would call institutional responses, looking toward school districts and schools, higher education, for example, and looking at what they can do. And I think that's a great place to start. And I think it's an important discussion to have, although I want to talk a little bit beyond that. But to Kevin's comment at the end of the last session around sort of people or organizations putting forward their proposed policy solutions to take advantage of this shock and of this situation, my response is, I not only not surprised that organizations are doing it, I'd expect them to do it. Because to some extent, what are promising practices pre-COVID are by and large going to continue to be promising practices post-COVID. There was a lot written on closing the digital divide before that became a reality, a necessity for school districts to take on. Considerable work about how the digital divide was creating inequalities and the challenges associated with it. And much of what was applicable to closing the digital divide prior to COVID remains applicable today. Likewise, efforts to emphasize authentic, culturally responsive learning or assessment practices, Laurie. We have been talking about this for a number of years, and it remains good teaching and learning practices prior to COVID. And it was, and I think it remains good teaching and learning practices in a COVID environment. Now there's some changes that I think we need to make. One of them, for instance, is strengthening distance and blended learning. Again, I would argue that was largely maybe more of an add-on, luxury for some school districts and schools. Now it's become a necessity. But largely what were good teaching and learning practices pre-COVID likely will continue to be good teaching and learning practices. And I think that as we look at this, we're going to see pockets of interesting activity and innovation. But school districts are figuring this out as they go, literally. And I think those pockets are going to be more a matter of circumstance and some individual prior thinking beforehand, and less from what I've seen, the result of a large-scale systematic policy approach taken by any particular state in this environment. I also make a couple other points when I talk to folks about this. And that is, I don't think that this disruption is an anomaly. I wish it was going to be, but I wasn't. I don't think it is. In the last panel, I heard this sense from Francesca specifically, that once we get back to school, it's all gonna go back to normal. And I don't think that's the case. I firmly believe that we have seen major disruptions on a minor scale in many circumstances that we can learn from. And I know it's been 100 years since we've seen a pandemic of this scale worldwide, but I'm gonna just venture to say it won't be 100 years before we see another one. And that we are going to see more disruptions. We have had school and schooling disrupted for large periods of time because of other natural disasters, hurricanes, wildfires, political unrest internationally. And when I talk to schools and school districts, I invite them to not just think through how to get through this disruption, but to how to think through schooling through disruptions. Because I do believe that we are going to see more of them. I think they're going to be sooner or more frequent. And as much as we've got a challenge with online learning, when I talk to superintendents, I tell them I would keep a strong online learning base partly because you don't know when you're going to have to go back to it. And I do believe that disruptions are going to be more and more the norm, and our approach should be how we think about schooling through disruptions instead of how do we get through this major disruption. My last point, and the area that I am most fascinated with in this entire COVID-19 situation, is how COVID-19 is changing the relationship between home and school. Listen to Michael Apple on the last session talk about even how he takes his current experiences and thinks through his experiences growing up. I do much the same thing as a first-generation college student. I think through what my home life would have been as a child had this happened. I wouldn't have probably learned very much, not because my family didn't care, but because they just weren't ready and equipped for this. And I think through my own daughters who are adjusting, because we're all adjusting in a very different environment. And one of the key things that I talk to school districts about in schools and others who call me is we got to remember that we have homes as schools and schools as homes in a way that we have not experienced before. I mean, at least to some extent. If a student had a difficult home life, they could go to a school where for a period of time, they could, and hopefully in some best cases, have some sense of structure and the opportunity to be inquisitive and the opportunity to engage. And now all of that is happening in the exact same space. And to me, that is really fascinating. I would argue, if I were to predict sort of the effect of this, I would argue that during this time, whatever the effect of home conditions are on academic achievement, they would increase or strengthen during this period because students are spending so much time at home. And so I have been reading what's been going on in the sort of mainstream literature on how parents are dealing with COVID and how they're turning their homes into schools or learning pods. Kevin, I put the one in the lower left-hand corner down as a potential NEPC policy topic, something like wear clothes and don't smoke big joints on screen while virtual learning, the impact or advice to parents for getting through a Zoom schooling, something like that. But in the schools that I talk to, this is a reality of this engagement of what's going on with students at home. I know school districts now are, the school districts I talk to are having conversations about when to call child protective services, when to think about intervening, what to just ignore, how to connect with students away from the online classes when they see some difficult situations at home. And at least from my perspective, I think this is an area not only of potential research, but if we could think of an area of potential service to the public policymakers and to parents. I think it's in this area here of this intersection between home and school that's just been blended in a manner that I can't think of on this scale, at least looking back in the literature ever. Even the one-room schoolhouse was a schoolhouse where students went away to school. So I think we're in sort of unprecedented territory here. But with that, hopefully we've engaged some interesting thoughts and conversation, and I will turn it over to Laurie. You ready, Laurie?
I am. I think so. Hang on. You can see that, right? Yes. Thanks, Kevin. All right. It flashes at me, so it's a little disconcerting. I invited David to go first because I felt like he had the broad view, and I was feeling guilty about having a narrower testing view. That's my area, obviously, so it's a lens I bring to this question. It's not in what we were asked, but I would like to defensively argue that it's what policymakers are getting a lot of. And I think using Michael Apple's concerns about commodification, and I think Francesca also talked about predatory salesmanship that we are experiencing. I believe that testing companies are eagerly arguing that they can document learning loss and that their tools are necessary to intervene and help kids learn. So I tried to put it all on one slide as a set of resources. If I'd had more space, I would have put Darth Vader, my old go-to, for the first part, and Luke Skywalker for the second part, because I've outlined my general message here is here's what people are claiming, and 2 examples. The NWEA has a set of researchers who took summer learning loss and projected it out to the number of months missed in the spring. And this is how deficient, word chosen intentionally, this is how deficient children will be coming to school. They also have well documented the likelihood of what David has already talked about. We know that this is landing disproportionately on communities of color, poor students, etc. Rick Hanushek, for OEDC, I'm surprised that they needed this to be done, but his general shtick is to get a multiplier and tell you how many gajillion dollars we're going to be behind as a world community because of how many kids are going to be deficient. So if that's the message you want, yes, kids are behind in a very linear way of talking about the skills that they must have to grow up. But there's lots of time, even for the seniors. And I think that it's a very factory model view, lockstep of this is what you've got to get every month or your future is ruined. That is part of what, it's very much what Democrats for Education Reform, DEFR advocates and neoliberals are saying. They're taking this as the occasion again to say we have to test to find these deficiencies and then we can remediate. And because they're so large, we can remediate for a long time. And there are already examples I can point to of districts that have decided to just go faster. Let's teach in the first 2 months, all of last year that you missed, and then we'll try to cram the rest of this year's science in. All of these are just not what kids need. So in the Luke Skywalker, more optimistic view, I've shared several resources. All but 2 of them have still an assessment focus, but they share this idea of uplift. Could we teach less? Think Ted Sizer, for heaven's sakes. Could we teach less and teach it deeply and with meaning? Could we connect it? And you and I, David, are both citing the Linda Darling-Hammond et al., many names after hers from LPI, that is the most ambitious of how we should use this occasion to reformulate how we think about education going forward. But I'm actually inviting people to think about what could you do this year, even if it's remote, to say time out. We want to just think about schooling differently. We're going to catch up later. We're going to have some heartfelt caring and deep learning going on now. And this is how we're going to connect with kids, many of whom are suffering traumatically. And so what they need is not to sit in front of computer screens for a full day without personal connections. I'm motivated by examples last spring that were in the paper about teachers going to the sidewalks of kids' homes and writing things on the sidewalk. Lots of important interventions for really young kids of paper things being handed out and brought from the school. Blue gloves, of course, but making the personal connection, because it's a lot harder this year if you didn't have a relationship already with your kids. In the previous session, we talked about the inequity of learning pods. why not do the same kind of thing that school districts have bravely done with food, and with computers sometimes, and hotspots? Why don't we think about who needs learning pods most? I'm really proud of our colleagues in the School of Ed, who, of course, in teacher education, you get the phone call that says, you know, my grandkids really need somebody couldn't we get the names of some of your candidates? Wouldn't they be great for, by the way, this very affluent setting? And our teacher education, elementary teacher education colleagues said, no, we're actually going to create learning pods for the essential workers on our campus if their kids need our candidates to provide that kind of quasi daycare and learning opportunities. School districts could be doing this. And I think an important thing that could come out of this experience would be for people to say out loud, we have limited resources, we can't give them out the way we have been, we're going to address the greatest needs. It's so interesting that they did it so automatically with computers that they don't quickly know how to turn that argument, which people have implicitly acceded to, into, and by the way, we're going to have smaller classes for these kids, etc. So I think there are lots of things we could do, but I think a main message is that we should do it differently in many ways. Let me just point to a couple of these things about teaching up. One of the resources there is Student Achievement Partners. They're encouraging, it's a not-for-profit, open source materials. They're arguing that you need to pick a few good things to focus on instead of trying to globally paste the curriculum. The Center for Assessment, Scott Marion and colleagues wrote this assessment-oriented thing for CCSSO, but they also talk about this idea of teaching up to the things that are most important. And if you're going to do any assessing, not this typical standardized test, you should be creating pre-assessments that are curricularly embedded and help teachers remediate in the context of that lesson, those things, because that's a meaningful connection instead of assigning kids to remediation ad nauseum. I'll show you just the other slides. I made one slide, David, and then I had two others that just kind of went along with it. Oh, for heaven's sakes. I'm clicking on it, slide 1 of 3, clicking on the arrow, there you go. So this is something that I wrote for Valerie Strauss's blog about why we didn't need multiple choice only diagnostic tests at the start of the year. And the Marion report and the Lynn Olson report on the previous slide all make this point that socio-emotional circumstance is more important than academic learning. And I can't believe how many people have a sideline curriculum to learn about kindness, but aren't thinking about their socio-emotional development in the context of however we take up academics. It shouldn't be a separate thing. And then this is a slide that also just summarizes the assessment point from the Marion et al. Paper for CCSSO. Lots and lots of stuff. I could go on and on, but I'm going to stop now. Lots and lots of people are claiming uses for state testing this spring that are completely ridiculous. They think they're going to find research about which interventions for COVID worked best, for example. And they're not thinking about the emotional wear and tear. They're not thinking about the complete insanity of trying to convene kids to take the test or to use data that their parents help them with, etc. And it would be good if people just thought again about whether we should test at all this year. And I am hopeful that 2 years of suspension will make us think differently before we resume this practice of test-driven education.
Thank you, Laurie. Folks, please chime in using the Q&A function with questions you want to ask. The phrase, Laurie, when you were speaking, the phrase that occurred to me that I hadn't put in this context before was a teaching moment or a teachable moment. You know, so in a particular class, when something comes up, you sort of set aside the planned curriculum a bit to take advantage of a particular moment. And to some extent, what I hear you and others saying is to sort of expand that to, I don't know, move from a moment to an era. I'm not sure, but it's a teachable era, right? It's a teachable global context that if we just return to the teaching the standards as we had planned and maybe try to accelerate that or even support kids to achieve that, which I think is generally a good idea. In other words, to keep the same high standards but provide some additional supports to the kids who need them, ignores the teachable moment or the teaching moment. It takes us out of this context, right? And yeah, so I just wondered if you could comment on that.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I would love it if people just said, time out. And it's too bad they're spending too much time figuring out we've got this many teachers who can be in person and this many who cannot. We've got to put the desks this far apart. They're so focused on the logistics of responding to the pandemic. They haven't asked themselves, at the end of this year would we want kids to say about their experience? And what if we just said, we're going to teach about germs this year? And we're going to learn about what it was like in the Civil War, and we're going to learn about the first microscope, and we're going to learn about why different people have different rules about cleanliness, etc. What if we just, and then I do believe that the way that teachers can most connect with kids is getting them to talk about their thinking in any subject area and talk with them. Even if you only have 2 30-minute check-ins per week per kid, or 1 15 or 20-minute check-in and responded to their thinking in writing. There are ways to go deep with kids if we didn't have to just be scurrying. This is rats in a maze ways of trying to accelerate, and not in the good way. Some people talk about ambitious curriculum as accelerated learning. No, they just mean go faster along this crazy track that is, it's just not reaching people. It's making people miserable, including teachers are being made miserable by coverage being exacerbated. So yes, this is a moment to say, as I said, time out, let's do something different.
And let me comment on that for just a second, because one of the things that I think is important from a political standpoint is to find unlikely allies. I think that if we just continue to bring the same folks to the same discussion, nothing changes. We have an unlikely ally here, and that is everybody, businesses included, are going through this exact same teachable moment. I like that. That education is. We're not alone. There are businesses who will no longer be face-to-face again. Companies who will continue to work 100% remote. That means these ideas that Laurie's talking about, there's that teachable moment, not just because it's an aha moment for education, but because if we put this in a policy or a political environment, we're not alone. And if companies can work 100% remotely and have accountability and et cetera, and think through how they can be productive, then I don't understand from a policy perspective why education can't get into that same discussion and open up these opportunities from a policy perspective that Laurie is talking about to rethink how we're teaching and learning and what the structure of school looks like.
Mhm. When you say, David, in your presentation, when you were saying that these sorts of disruptions, I mean, it won't be identical to this disruption, but major disruptions in the future are so likely that school districts should be sort of planning for them, and particularly it sounded like planning for them in the sense of remote learning, and maybe even remote in-house learning, using your phrase.
Well, let's think through if you were a school district in Alabama, Florida, that part of the country.
Mm-hmm.
If you were a school district in that part of the country, you were anticipating a disruption or two through hurricane season now for the last 2 decades. And it's gotten worse. Every hurricane is unprecedented and historic. I think that if you are in that part of the country, disruptions on an annual basis for a significant period of time are now your normal. If you are in California, for example, I had wildfires as my other example. During wildfire season, if you are a school district and a school, you are preparing for a potential disruption. I think we have seen major disruptions on a minor scale. That is why when I'm talking to school districts, I talk about, don't think through, and this maybe goes to Laurie's point, don't think through how do we just get past this one giant disruption. I believe that, and somebody, I think it was Michael, mentioned that this is the 5th pandemic since 2000. That's true. And I kind of say this is on this scale, this is a scale that is above the others that have come before it. But if you're a school district, thinking through how to continue to promote learning through disruptions would be, because now that you've thought about it, you may have some infrastructure. Thinking through that, I think, is valuable so that you're ready for future disruptions.
Laurie, did you want to respond to that?
I'm looking that you don't have any question and answers, but you've got lots of people talking in the chat. So you may want to look there for your questions.
That'll just encourage them. I want them to move them over to Q&A.
I see. You're trying to be stern, Kevin. We know you can't do that.
It's like those rats in the maze. You have to keep training.
Well, I'd love people to react to this question about, and I do think there's some seasonality to this too. I think that to be practical, when I'm talking about arguing with policy leaders in my state about not testing this spring, I know that there's one time point after the election that will make it possible to have that conversation. And then really you have to wait until January to see what the health circumstances like. But it does, it is a sadness to me that people have not, for the whole fall, thought about how could we do this differently? How could we organize kids in small groups and have them know each other in ways that maybe they couldn't do in the classroom, etc. So Deb is jumping in. Great.
So Kevin, I have to type the question and I have to say it?
Yep, that's the rule.
Got it.
Gosh, how can she talk and type too? I can't do that.
I lately have gotten a lot of questions from district partners because of the challenging, stressful situation of COVID and so many other stresses in people's lives in the economic crisis, as families are losing livelihoods and don't have access to technology and so on. Districts want to support kids and they see socio-emotional learning as a possible venue for doing that and want my advice for bilingual kids. If I know about SEL curriculum, they can just put on top of whatever they're doing to help. I have my own answers to that, but I'm curious how, given what you've been saying, which I really am really glad to be hearing, what kinds of things would you advise us to do when faced with districts asking this sorts of things?
Well, so I raised socio-emotional, so let me try to respond. And I think the kindness curriculum is the archetypal example, but there are many. And it just sets it aside. And measurement people are the worst about this, by the way. They admit that standardized testing has been bad, so they want to add a measure of socio-emotional learning.
Right.
And I want to use what we know about learning that says it's who I am and how I am made to feel a belonging in this class that supports my cognitive learning and what Francesca was talking about this morning, the social learning. The more we have to make those two separate things, the more we're still not using what we know about the most efficacious supports. So Deb, knowing what you know about emerging bilinguals and support for kids, I feel like teachers need more training to encourage, what our colleague Elizabeth Dutro has done, is have kids write about trauma and make it okay for kids to bring the stories about what's happening in their lives into the classroom. To me, that's social emotional learning. It's making it about the feelings. And by the way, I can defend the writing skills that will suddenly blossom if kids are writing and talking about things that matter. You've got lots of other problems to solve, of course, because that means I'm invading privacy sometimes, and there's some harm with that, but there are some difficulties with that. But I think it is meaningful learning, and this is the place to be doing that kind of work.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, let's, I think, Bill, you're up.
But muted.
Unmuted, I
Thanks.
hope. I wonder if we're not looking at the right problem and deep enough. Some people talk about an extinction event. If we don't do something about the society and the way that it works, if we don't do something about our political structure, and this isn't academic, it's got to change. If we don't do something about the diseases, if we don't do something about the weather, the whole 9 yards, and we don't have a lot of time, and to talk about reordering a curriculum in a very cognate kind of way, this is the problem.
Do either one of you want to comment on that?
That's a big question, Bill. And I think you have institutional responses, I think, tied to my slide. I feel when I put institutional responses there that some of what I'm reading, it doesn't have the urgency that you're talking about, isn't thinking about the scope in which is in front of us, or even the possibilities we have to change the system in the way that Laurie's mentioning. I think that some of these institutional responses sound a lot like what we were talking about before COVID, or what was discussed before COVID, now put into a COVID context. I think that the context is different, and that this is an opportunity for us to get beyond those institutional responses. Because I agree with you. The challenge is how do we get that out in pieces where policymakers politicians, I should be more specific, can take action on these large issues in ways that can continue to move us forward, but they need to be actionable. And there is a great challenge, and to be frank with you, wonderful discussion. Talk about the opportunity to learn about the impacts of real world and political system. Great opportunity for schools to have that discussion right now, for parents to be involved in that discussion in a way that before may have felt a little mechanical. Let's talk about it at school and go home. It's all happening at one place right now.
I'm seeing Michelle Renee is saying in the chat that, you do have to be careful when you ask kids to write about trauma, that it's not an invasion. And so that is part of what having parental contact and kid contact and treading lightly, but there's a whole literature on the significance of kids addressing deeply traumatic, my father died, my brother's in prison. These are very difficult things. And that's what kids are thinking about. And so we're asking them to be false when they come into the schooling context. If they don't have a chance to talk about those things, then they also need to have a chance to say that's private or yes, I'm ready to share. That's part of the conversation, and they're learning how to do that. To the conversation you were just having, I'm not prepared to abandon what I know about working in schools and rush off to solve the political context. But what was said in the earlier panel today, I want to affirm. Those kids have learned things about oppression, about the role of race in our history. I know that homeschooling started, if you remember, several decades ago, burgeoned because we said we were going to teach kids to think in schools, and it scared off 10% of the US population who didn't want their kids taught to think. That was actually we said. You remember that? Do the history of when did homeschooling take off? It's when we said we wanted to help kids learn to think, to learn words like oppression and what it means. And so I do think that we are having a civic and democratic impact by providing that access to those kinds of issues from our history and from our current context.
Susan.
Hi, thanks for having this conversation. It has been fascinating. My question is, many advocates are worried about not having the data, especially around learning outcomes, as they use this data to push and justify resourcing for students furthest from opportunity, and to keep a focus on their needs, as often they are not prioritized within the broader political system. So how do we get out of this testing and data trap?
It's actually better, David, if the politician answers.
Yeah, I will. So years ago, I tried to get rid of standardized testing in Arizona, affirmatively. And the biggest pushback came from teachers. It came from upper echelon communities, high socioeconomic status communities, and communities who felt that they were most disenfranchised and wanted to, I think, continue that discussion and that deliberation. It was an interesting project for me to take this on. One of the things I could not get past that I still think about and talk to folks about is, I think there's a difference between the data and how we use the data. And we can collect data, but have a lot of flexibility in how we use it. Laurie, I would argue that if there was testing and no consequences associated with it, in that ideal world, it likely would not bring about the same fervor and the same consternation that it currently does today. But policymakers can't divorce the two, that you can't have data without doing something with it from an accountability and from a consequence standpoint. And I, as hard as I tried, could not separate those two ideas, that we could test and use data for a reason other than to find out who was on top, who was on bottom, and who needed intervention and who was in trouble. And that was a hard argument for me to win over. And that's got a lot of scars from that one.
Yeah, I think that what you just said is exactly right. And the way we get to this situation where we have this juggernaut of a testing regime, and all these people write about balanced assessment, who just had less at the accountability level. But people try to claim that the accountability test also has instructional value. So then they layer on, make it really long so that they can have all these sub-test scores, which is ridiculous. So the data you need to know what probably you already could know from need indices, not from achievement indices. If you were sincerely wanting to help the most in need communities, you would help the very communities that had the highest non-attendance during COVID, the lack of hotspots, the lack of computers, et cetera. You could know where to direct resources differentially. And so it's, people are insincere when they say, we have to have the data or we can't help. Well, no, you haven't been helping for 30 years. And so to get data to know whether we're making progress or not, you could have a very light touch, short test, even with sampling, another whole issue, so that you could track and monitor achievement. But you have to stop then claiming that and then I'm going to intervene with these individual kids, and separating those things so that what I do with individual kids is much more curricularly embedded and not the same thing as that state test. There's a way to do it, but people have to understand those two different purposes for assessing.
Lori, I got a sampling bill on the floor, and it died because an amendment came forward from a parent who wanted to for parents to opt into the sample because they wanted to know where their students stood. They wanted the option to opt in, again, so that they could understand relative to everyone else where their student ranked. And at that point, it defeated the purpose of a sample.
Yeah,
But
well, no,
yes.
so David, I've actually learned a lesson, and I don't talk about sampling kids anymore, especially now that we can do pretty good adaptive testing, where you know, kids are at different levels and get something that's better for where they are, and then those can all be integrated. And so I talk about a really short test. Then everybody takes it. Then you don't have that parent complaining, because it's about 1/3 of the population that is that parent. And then, it's good to listen to the public and know which of those things are immovable. And I agree with you. I think that one's immovable.
Yeah, it was an interesting twist.
Okay. I'm bringing in Michelle.
Hello, guys. This is so interesting. I was thinking about, so as the two of you were talking, there's this great tension. It's not a tension that has to be resolved, but it's a good, healthy tension between Laurie sort of suggesting, as a society, we should stop and pause and like completely reframe. David, I hear you saying a little bit more like, this is the new normal. Climate change is happening. It's causing catastrophic fires and storms. We know communities of color are going to be hit the most by those storms and by fires and by the impacts of global warming. That's proven, right? So what is the difference, or where, I'm looking for the Black feminist both and in that from you guys, because I think there is one. And I'm curious for the two of you to explore together, where is the both and of like, both accepting this reality, but also challenging this reality. Like I see really good strength in both.
Michelle, I have been reading your comments on the right-hand side and fascinated by them. I'm glad you got a chance to speak. Let me tell you where I think it is, and Laurie, we can obviously connect on this. I think Laurie and I are both in this discussion talking to the field in a way. We're talking to schools, school districts. Laurie's comment, because our dean, by the way, got the same calls. Laurie, can we have your students come do learning pods for us?
Yeah.
And so in that,
Absolutely.
in that perspective, I think that it's a two-step response. What my response to this, Michelle, when I talk to school districts, they just want to weather this storm. Just get us through this storm. And they believe that if we get through COVID, we're going to get back to schools and things will be relatively normal. And my stance is twofold. Number one, I don't think that this disruption is singular, and I think we're going to continue to see disruptions. And so you might want to think about how to continue to teach and learn and to conduct schooling through disruptions, because I don't think this is a singular one-off response that happens. It's going to happen. I think it's already been happening in other parts of the country. I believe that we need to get school districts and the folks out in the field and politicians past this idea that this is a one-off we need to get through in order to get to Laurie's discussion, which is, let's take this opportunity now, if this is going to be a different world, and think about that world and think about schools, schooling, testing, how we teach, what we teach, where we teach in fundamentally new ways. And to me, mine is sort of a precursor to a larger opening up teachable moment for Laurie. That's how I see it. Laurie?
I think I agree. It's not either or. Though I admit that you're mostly speaking in a context where people think they're going to get back to normal, and all the political press is about getting back to normal. So then it makes sense for me to say, just take a breath, and for now, let's do this.
Yeah.
But I'm not thinking, and then we'll get back to normal. I'm thinking, and then we will have opened up possibilities and seen some remarkable things that kids can do, even in a pandemic, if you teach in deeply meaningful ways for them and invite their parents and do things that then they can be proud of, and they can have a Zoom celebration about the project that they worked on. You know, this is a way into some project-based learning, into some culturally relevant pedagogy that people talked about but didn't know how to do. This is a time. And then it's also launches the conversation that I think the Darling-Hammond report invites, which is take a much bigger look. And it's not a return to normal look, to David's point about, and yes, in that future, there will continue to be disruptions, but presumably, if we learn some important lessons, it's not just when there's a hurricane that we're going to have meaningful learning and write about the hurricane.
Exactly.
You know, why don't we do it all the time? Yeah, but it's an occasion to have that conversation is what I'm saying.
Oops, I just brought Michelle Drummond in. That was not my, hold on. Michelle, you don't need to speak.
Thanks, you guys.
Bring in all sorts of people.
Yeah, Michael coming in, Miriam coming in.
So, Michael, you're the one who I'm trying to bring in. I'm going to try to send folks back. I don't know what happened.
Michael, you need to unmute when he brings you in.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm not sure. Michael?
In and out.
Did I just get rid of Mike? Oh,
yes, you did.
It was going so smoothly. Okay, hold on. So I'm bringing Michael back, and I'm going to keep trying to Miriam and.
I was okay continuing to argue with people in the chat.
Yeah, so Michael has been having an argument with Michelle and Deb about remote learning and its potential. So why don't you, it looks like the question you have for Laurie and David is similar. So why don't we jump in there?
Well, the question that I did have for the panelists, I did post in the Q&A like you asked us. And it was basically, one of my arguments is one of the reasons why what we've seen happening both in the spring and now in the fall has been so bad is simply because folks just don't know what good online learning looks like, or good independent learning, good distance learning, whatever, regardless of the medium that you're looking at. And one of the reasons for that is because within higher education, we've given them no sense of that. You know, in the last panel, and you guys have mentioned it today, you know, about how the companies will come in and, you know, use their analytics that their systems create to show teachers how they should be focusing things. But I mean, most of us here are in a university environment. Have any of us ever showed our students the analytics that the learning management system collects and how they could use those to make pedagogical and instructionally designed sound decisions towards their students? You know, I mean, if we're failing our future educators, we can't be surprised when they go forth and fail. So, I mean, while I'm not writing off this generation of teachers and school leaders, I think it's time for us to take a hard look and say, what sort of changes based upon all of the things we've seen go wrong in the past 8 months do we need to start making now? And do we need to, when we go to our departmental meetings, start arguing with our colleagues that these types of things should be part of our curriculum? And in some cases it is, specifically about designing distance learning experience, but in other cases it's about creating the community when you don't have people around, and some of those other soft skills that you need to figure out how to do at a distance. So I'm just wondering, since you guys have thought a bit about this, what would be on your list if you were making this argument to your colleagues about how we need to change so that the next group of educators are better prepared?
I think for teacher education, I don't want to separate, here's how you go learn about technology and here's how you learn about curriculum and instructional practices. And so I think that I am proud of and learn from as many of our faculty who are at ease, demonstrating that in how they conduct their university level classes. Those of us who aren't as far along are still learning, because I think you have to model it. But I think it is best done when it's done in the content methods classes where these ways of teaching writing, for example, or this way of having kids work on math problems is lifted by the technology. I must say, and I use the example of mathematics, with young kids, the need for them to draw models on paper is contesting with this idea that I would do it all with online affordances. So I think it has to be a mix with attention to the developmental needs of the kids. Because I think in some cases, especially in assessment, but in technology generally, some of the practices that got at kids thinking and representing their thinking to share have actually gotten worse in a technological space.
I would venture to say that it's the research is there. The models are there. I think they have been in lots of ways seen as an extra and not fundamental to education. Project-based learning, you get a piece of it here and there. You get some interesting pods of activity, but it's been overrun, in my opinion, for the last couple decades over this overarching absolute crush on standardized tests and ranking and labels. And these very exciting pedagogical ideas and experiments blossom here and there, but haven't been able to flourish because that's not where the day-to-day is for most schools. If they can get a little bit of it in, that's great. I would argue at this time now, we've got an opportunity to put these exciting pedagogical approaches that Laurie is talking about, that we write about, that when I read, I try to teach to my kids. Over the summer, my daughters and I, we did a lot of project-based learning because I happen to know a little bit about it, read a little bit about it, but not every family is in that circumstance. But now that, I think, is central, can be presented as central to teaching and learning instead of an extra. And that's how I hear about it. I hear about some of these exciting ideas as extras as opposed to the fundamentals of what should be good teaching and learning.
Yeah, and to your point, David, there are some bright spots, and they're disproportionately in schools that have the advantage of not worrying about their test scores. So that
That's
regime
exactly right.
is preventing that kind of investment in deep learning opportunities.
And if you're a school that's behind on your test scores, Laurie, that becomes your singular focus, unfortunately, when the reality is we should maybe, and this could prompt the conversation of, maybe let's try another approach. Instead of a singular focus on test questions day in and day out to get students ready for the test, we have them think differently and engage differently, because it's a hard conversation to have when you're that principal who's waiting for those test results to get back.
Yeah, so I need to thank you, Kevin, and ask you to share the resource that I won't be able to name. But Kevin invited me to co-write a chapter with Jeff Palladino, who's the principal of Fannie Lou Hamer Freedom High School in the Bronx. And its whole history comes right out of Central Park East. And it's all project-based learning, and it's portfolio assessment. And they have a waiver that they have to recompete for every several years from Regents exams. And the resource, Kevin, that you're putting in, I hope, in the chat, is the Performance Assessment Consortium that convenes teachers to learn how to score portfolios and to support their instruction, and also puts together the data that helps them get the waiver. And so that is something I should credit Linda Darlingham and way back to Central Park East time in helping to get that that consortium to have the political wherewithal to make that happen. So that's an example, and it's got a long history now. It's survived wonderfully.
I will do my best to. I mean,
if not, I'll share after this.
I mean, I'll put a link in here. Hold on.
Okay, that's what I meant. Thank you.
Okay, here you go. So that's a link to how it works for the consortium.
Yep.
Liz.
Yeah, hi, I'm Liz. I think a lot about teaching and teacher preparation, and I know a lot of teachers are eager to do some of this reimagining and might feel constrained by their administration, their local context. I wonder if you have any thoughts about how teachers could respond to and maybe try to resist some of these pressures in this moment.
Well, I won't claim that it's uniformly simple out there. And so it really depends. But I think that if you don't try at all, we make no progress. So colleagues of grade level teachers can together do some things that a single teacher couldn't do by themselves. Sometimes having this kind of outlook is what got you recruited to the school in the first place. So if a school is brave enough, then others in the district are able to say, "What we want to do that too." So it's just it's a grassroots lifting up that I've seen work when it works. I admit that it's really hard, and I admit that it's really hard if you're isolated. You know, if you've tried and you've been punished, I don't have an answer except self-care, right? And looking for another opportunity, or doing for the kids interpersonally in ways that you weren't able to do curricularly. But a lot of people have been able to be effective against that kind of oppression.
David, do you want to add anything to that?
I would. Liz, I think right now, because things are in such disarray, and school districts, if they tell you they know where they're going next, they're probably not being honest with you, because they really don't. They're looking for, they're looking for solutions out there. They're looking for something that can work. And I think now in this sort of chaotic environment is a good opportunity to try some experiments and to put forward your successes. I think that it's because there are so many unanswered questions out there. I think you're going to find an environment where people may be more open to some innovative approaches that they weren't open to before, because, like I said, they have no idea. They're flying this plane they're building it as they fly it.
Laurie, when you were presenting, you said something like school districts can be doing this, and you're referring to things like the pods, you know, basically the
Yes.
approaches. But yes, to some extent they can, but the resources are very limited. And school districts are being asked to do this, but also to provide safe remote learning in general, right? Or some sort of all the safety measures that need to be in place, and to address a lot of the trauma-related and larger inequities that are falling on families. And Fannie Lou Hamer is a very good example of this. Schools that are stepping up to do other things to meet needs. At the same time, when state budgets are being hit by the economic collapse or now economic recession, and Congress and the White House have done very little to help backfill compared to even the last recession. So, I mean, is it true that schools really can be doing this, or can schools just be doing a little of this based on the minimal resources they have?
They can just be doing a little. And an important point, so I'm glad you asked me to clarify or expand. An important point is, I don't think they've been brave enough or just had enough time to focus on whether or not they should decide to do it differentially for kids who need it most. So I do, and I said, look, they had an implicit decision to spend limited resources, to your point, on computers. Sometimes they ask families to share them instead of every kid gets their own. So they didn't do it very generously or paying close enough attention to what it meant in those households. But they essentially, there was a policy commitment to disproportionate response in proportion to the need. And I'm saying they haven't thought that way very much about other ways of allocating resources. To a certain extent now it's opening up, yes, we're gonna do in-person for K through 2. So that's a preferential treatment, if you will, because you have to reassign teachers to do that. It takes a lot of figuring out who's willing to do that, can do it, to do that. I do know of some instances where special education kids are getting small classes and some in person per week when everybody else is still remote. So that's an example of what I'm talking about. But why not English language learners? Why not kids whom we know last spring didn't attend? They disappeared. You have that data. Do those kids need to have a special supplement? So an adult, it doesn't even have to be the classroom teacher. It could be in addition to the classroom teacher, helping them with what's now being delivered online. So I'm just saying, you have indicators of where you could differentially allocate, and I admit, very limited resources. I just think sometimes those questions aren't being asked.
And Kevin, let me talk to, I think the other side of the question, or the finance question, is the amount of resources is one thing, but the flexibility to use those resources given school finance laws is another. I've been part of a little group trying to put together, how can we think as creatively and as flexible under current school finance laws in Arizona to allow school districts that want to do learning pods today? And we got this solution, at least it's an interesting interpretation of our school finance laws. No district has stepped up to do it yet. I'm hoping one of them tests it. But the other question we're also asking ourselves is, what changes do we need to make in school finance so that we can allocate the resources in the manner that Laurie is suggesting here, so that you have that flexibility. Because a lot of our, our funding models are built around brick mortar, seats in the seats in desk kind of structures. We need to think about changing that fundamentally if we want to give school districts I think a green light to engage in some of these innovative practices.
Thanks. Anna?
Hi. I guess my question is just more sort of current, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on schools using letter grades versus pass-fail. That's something that's come up recently, and I just would like to know what you think.
Good idea. And that is a little bit of the flavor of time out, but I think there's a larger conversation. We had the Alfie Cohen quotation in the previous session about grading in general. I am not completely against grades for the oldest kids, especially you're locked into grades if you want to get rid of the SAT, because you probably don't have a plan for not having either as some kind of threshold for college level work. So I'm in favor of grades that aren't bell curve, that give many chances, that give lots of different ways of representing what A quality work looks like. So there's a whole story about grading, and only for high school students, because I think before that, you're inviting kids, and this is a terrible part of our current system, you're inviting kids to work for grades instead of working to learn. And by the way, the electronic platforms and Infinite Campus and point systems have had devastating consequences. So any glimmer that 20 years ago people had other ideas about grading has been extinguished by the surveillance technology to keep parents informed of how many points leading to grades. So it takes a lot of work to get away from that. I do think a portfolio system like Fannie Lou Hamer, Kevin, thank you for this hard assignment to go write about a school I'd never visited, but it's another good example of ways of representing learning is the point, not points and grades.
Hi, this is Hannah. And as y'all have mentioned, COVID-19 has the potential to be a significant structural disruption to the accountability regime. And we can't currently talk about schooling without talking about home, as for now, school and home are sharing the same space in a lot of cases. And the pandemic is providing educators with this unique opportunity to work together more closely with families, but I'm wondering if that's happening. And as researchers, what theories or frameworks are you looking toward, and should we look toward when we're thinking about reimagining schooling to be more responsive to folks and less reactive to accountability?
That's a great question that ties together both of our points here. Hannah, I agree with you. I think this is the most, to me, we've got these system institutional disruptions, which I think are important and fascinating, but we've also got this complete fundamental change of space where school and home are commingled, and they're sharing the same space, sitting across from my daughter as I'm working and she's on Zoom. Do I know, are schools taking advantage of this opportunity to work with families more closely? I wish I could point out a couple really good examples of that, and I've been looking. I have been paying attention, as I mentioned in my introduction, to kind of a lot of the mainstream literature where they're talking to, where the focus is parents, and I haven't seen a lot of it. I've seen two major discussions. One, how to get through Zoom. Everything from how to share a screen to how to, the mechanics of Zoom, to the safety of Zoom, really the mechanics of how to get through Zoom schooling. And then second, on the educator side, really how to deal with what they're seeing in the backdrops in students' homes, what they're seeing behind the student, and what to do about that. And I think that right now it's been more of a triage discussion than a meaningful, and I hope we can get into a meaningful discussion on how to think about this dual space. But what I've seen to date has largely been on, and that goes to my headline, what to do with the parent without a shirt smoking a big joint in the back. And it's more reactionary, but boy, there's a great opportunity, I think, to get into this space and to think about some new ways of engaging homes and schools in some dynamic ways. To me, that's exciting. So,
Just to
Lorrie,
be-
you can handle the accountability question.
I think it's important to know that that's perfectly legal here in Colorado. It's in Arizona that it's a problem.
So maybe it's just an Arizona thing. Maybe it's okay
Yeah.
for parents to be smoking big joints in the back.
I have an answer, but I think there's a procedural thing that needs to come before. And in addition to thinking about how can we differentially allocate resources, which I've spoken to before, I think it would be useful for schools or districts to think through questions about the instructional day. And watching my grandkids, there are different ways that people are doing this. And thinking about, for sure, you don't just talk for 6 hours every day. So what is the right or possible, or here's how you should think about it and be a caring professional. Here's how many delivery minutes and hours. Here's how much student interaction, and here's how much one-on-one would be productive. And I haven't heard people think through those things. Every teacher that I know personally is embedding that on their own. So that's a question back to Hannah's question about family. I think it's also a question about how to do project-based learning occasions in ways that bring parents in. So instead of learning about baking in, to use sort of Louise Moll's ideas or carpentry, how can those, and have the kid kind of recruit that information from home, what limited amount of time, respecting which parents aren't at home during screen time, could participate in that kind of interaction where their knowledge and skills are brought to bear on what we're doing in the classroom. And the time of that has to be pretty limited in respect for the parent, out of respect for the parents. But parents shouldn't just be the aide sitting at the side of the kid, keeping their attention on the screen. That's not the best ways of interacting with parents, especially parents for whom that's not their usual work experience. So I think we have to think aloud about how to do that, and it should have a real meaningful connection to what we're trying to do in the curriculum.
Yeah, the idea of parents as co-educators at home, Lorrie, would be I think a fascinating session for school districts to engage in.
Wow, believe it or not, we are running out of time. We just have time for some final comments. You were both on the last session where I said, you know, a nice final question is to speak to younger researchers or researchers who are thinking about these issues and want to explore something important. So that's one way to wrap up, but I'll leave it open to each one of you, some final comments.
Well, our previous colleagues wisely said that they wouldn't prescribe for younger scholars.
That's why I didn't ask that question again, because I figured you'd cheat and just comment.
But I think we've opened the door to this enormous array of what's out there that is against the harmful paradigm that we see. So what are those good disruptive examples? What's the context that supports them? And then this pivot that we've already talked about, which is just right now, and then what into the future, because none of us think it's going to be back to business as usual.
I started with a political policy framework. I will end there. I think this is an absolutely opportune time to do exactly what Lorrie is mentioning. And it's because we're not alone. Businesses are going to be going through this, nonprofits, everyone around education is going to go through a fundamental change as a result of COVID as a matter of course. And I think that education being part of that discussion, not separate from it, because there is some danger being the only sector who's focusing on this. If everybody is going through this change, then I think it becomes normal in the sense that policy changes don't look as dramatic. Politicians are seeing whole-scale changes in their lives and in their businesses, and so when big changes come in education, it's easier to make that connection with them. And I think that putting together those ideas right now, beyond just, and as I mentioned, the institutional responses, getting beyond the institutional responses to some whole-scale ways of rethinking education and its purpose, in my opinion, this is an opportune, fantastic time to do just that. Right at 3:30.
A warm thank you to our attendees, to Laurie and David, and to everyone who joined us throughout the day. I think we might just cancel the in-person versions of this, because clearly learning this way is preferable, we've learned today. We should just do this again next year. No, it's been great. Thank you both for sharing your vast experience and insights. Yeah, I see lots of thank yous over here on the Zoom chat.
Thank you, Kevin. You've had a
Thanks,
long
Kevin.
Zoom day. We appreciate you. And
I actually really like the suggestion of bringing in the folks to ask the questions also.
Yeah.
We live and we learn.
A little less pressure on the talking heads, Kevin, as I mentioned.
Yeah.
Thank you. Have a great rest of the day, everyone, and a good weekend. Bye-bye.